So far in this program, we've been talking about sentences. Now I'm about to introduce a new word for a reason which will soon become apparent. This new word is clause. And here's the definition. A clause is a group of words that includes both a subject and a verb. Now you may be thinking, gee, that sounds an awful lot like a sentence, because after all the sentences we've looked at up to this point do contain both subjects and verbs. So how is a clause different from a sentence? Well, that will become obvious in a moment. Let me explain that there are two kinds of clauses. One of them is the same as a sentence and the other is not. But it's important to understand both kinds of clauses because larger and more complicated sentence structures may involve both kinds of clauses. Here's how it works. The first kind of clause is an independent clause. An independent clause is one that can stand alone as a sentence. Why? Because it expresses a complete thought. You know the word independent means able to stand on one's own. When the United States became independent from the country that founded it, England, the United States was able to stand on its own, and an independent clause can stand on its own as a sentence. Take a look at this example. Europa is one of the moons of Jupiter. Now, this is a clause because it's a group of words that contains both a subject and a verb. Can you identify the subject and the verb in this sentence? The subject is Europa. Europa is what the sentence is about. The verb is. That is what Europa is or does in this sentence. It is something. And the rest of the words tell us what Europa is. One of the moons of Jupiter. So this is a clause because it contains both a subject and a verb. It's also a sentence because this happens to be an independent clause. A clause that is able to stand alone as a sentence because it expresses a complete thought. Well, if an independent clause can stand alone as a sentence, what do you call a clause that cannot stand alone as a sentence? The answer is a subordinate clause. The word subordinate means following or less important than, and this describes what these clauses are like. A subordinate clause can't stand alone as a sentence because it doesn't express a complete thought. Usually subordinate clauses begin with particular types of words which are known as subordinating conjunctions. A conjunction is a word that connects two groups of words, and the word subordinating means making something less important. So a subordinating conjunction is a word that connects the subordinate clause to the rest of the sentence and makes the subordinate clause less important. Because the subordinating conjunction is present, the subordinate clause can't stand alone as a sentence. Here are some examples of subordinating conjunctions. If, after, because, since, although, when, until. Normally, a clause that begins with one of these words, one of these subordinating conjunctions, can't stand alone as a sentence because it won't express a complete thought. Therefore, we consider it a subordinate clause. Take a look at this example. Because Europa has oceans filled with water like the earth. Now, this is a clause because it does contain a subject and a verb. The subject is Europa. The verb is has. So far, so good. But can this stand alone as a sentence? No. I think if you listen to this group of words, you can see that the clause doesn't express a complete thought. It says, because Europa has oceans filled with water like the earth. This leaves you wondering what the speaker is getting at. Because Europa has oceans filled with water, therefore what? We're waiting for some conclusion. It sounds as though the sentence is leading to some conclusion, but none is presented. And therefore, this isn't a complete sentence. Rather, it's a subordinate clause, one that cannot stand alone as a sentence. And if this were to appear in a piece of writing as if it were a complete sentence, that would be a mistake. This is really a sentence fragment. This is a subordinate clause because it begins with the subordinating conjunction because. Notice that having the subordinating conjunction because there makes this into a subordinate clause. If you were to take away that subordinating conjunction, the sentence would become an independent clause. It could stand alone as a sentence. The sentence would then say, Europa has oceans filled with water like the earth. Now that sounds like a complete thought. But when you put the subordinating conjunction because in front of it, it makes the clause less important. It makes it feel as though it needs to be attached to something else in order to express a complete thought. So this is the second type of clause. An independent clause can stand alone as a sentence. A subordinate clause cannot. And a subordinate clause usually begins with a subordinating conjunction. Now, why is it important to know about subordinate clauses? Because subordinate clauses are an important building block in many sentences. In fact, there are 4 different kinds of sentence structures that you need to know about, and subordinate clauses are important in some of them. The 4 types of sentence structures that you need to understand are the simple sentence, the compound sentence, the complex sentence, and the compound complex sentence. Let's take a look at each. First, a simple sentence. A simple sentence consists of one independent clause. Remember, an independent clause can stand alone as a sentence, and when it does, the result is what we call a simple sentence. For example, life may exist on Europa. This simple sentence contains the subject, life, the verb, which has 2 words, may exist, and taken together it is one clause, one independent clause, and therefore a simple sentence. By contrast, a compound sentence contains 2 or more independent clauses, which are joined either by a comma and a coordinating conjunction or a semicolon. That's a complicated definition, so let's take it piece by piece. A compound sentence contains 2 or more independent clauses. As we've seen, an independent clause can stand alone as a sentence, but 2 of them can also be joined together to form a compound sentence. Now, when you have 2 independent clauses and you want to join them together, you have to do it according to certain rules. And there are basically 2 alternatives, 2 ways of making that connection. One way of making the connection is by using a comma and a coordinating conjunction. There are a few different words that are called coordinating conjunctions. The most important and common ones are and, or, and but. So one way of joining 2 independent clauses to create a compound sentence is by using a comma and the word and, or but. Another way of connecting 2 independent clauses to make a compound sentence is by using a semicolon in between them. Let's take a look at an example of a compound sentence. Many astronomers believe in extraterrestrial life, but others disagree. Here we have 2 independent clauses which have been joined together to form a single compound sentence. The first independent clause is, many astronomers believe in extraterrestrial life. The word extraterrestrial means life outside of this planet, outside of the Earth. That could stand alone as a sentence. It's an independent clause. It contains the subject, astronomers, and the verb believe, and it could stand alone as a sentence. Then we have the clause, but others disagree. That could also stand alone as a sentence. It contains the subject others, the verb disagree, and the word but tells you that there's a contrast to the preceding idea. Nonetheless, it could stand alone as a sentence. It's perfectly all right to begin a sentence with a word like but or and. In any case, this is another independent clause. So this could have been set up as 2 separate sentences. But because the ideas are closely connected, the writer wanted to link them. How did he do it? By using a comma and the coordinating conjunction but. Putting that comma and the word but in there makes it easy to connect the 2 clauses to form one sentence. namely a compound sentence, because it's made up of two independent clauses. Now remember, we said there's another way of creating a compound sentence, and that is to use a semicolon in place of the comma and the coordinating conjunction. So this sentence would also be correct if it read as follows. Many astronomers believe in extraterrestrial life, semicolon. Others disagree. This would also be a correct way of creating this compound sentence. The point? A compound sentence consists of two independent clauses, and there are two alternative ways of joining them to make a single sentence. So that's our second type of sentence, simple sentence and a compound sentence. Now for the third type. A complex sentence contains an independent clause and one or more subordinate clauses. Now remember, the subordinate clause cannot stand alone as a sentence. However, it works perfectly well when it is attached to an independent clause. It normally has a secondary or less important meaning, and it needs the independent clause in order to express a complete thought. Let's take a look at an example of how this works. Here's a sentence. If extraterrestrial life is ever discovered, it will change human history. Now here we have two clauses. The first clause says, if extraterrestrial life is ever discovered. The subject of this clause is life. The verb is discovered. It's a two-word verb, and in this case, the word ever happens to come in between the two parts of the verb. That happens sometimes. So the subject and the verb is life is discovered, and the whole clause reads, if extraterrestrial life is ever discovered. Now let's pause. Is that an independent clause or a subordinate clause? Could it stand alone as a sentence? Well, think about how it sounds. If extraterrestrial life is ever discovered. Doesn't it leave you hanging? It leaves you wondering what the author is building toward. It sounds as though some conclusion is necessary. Therefore, we don't have a complete thought. We do have a subordinate clause. This is a clause that can't stand alone as a sentence. Let's take a look at the other clause and see what that is like. The other clause reads, it will change human history. This is a clause because it contains a subject and a verb. The subject is it, and will change is the verb. It will change human history. Now, could this clause stand alone as a sentence? Yes, it could. It expresses a complete thought. It will change human history. That could be a sentence by itself. So this is an independent clause. In this case, therefore, we have a subordinate clause first, followed by an independent clause. The two things work together to create a single, complete thought. If extraterrestrial life is ever discovered, it will change human history. The first clause sets up a possibility, and the second clause explains what would happen if that possibility comes true. So the two clauses work together to express one complete idea. And therefore we have a correct sentence which is known as a complex sentence, because that's what a complex sentence does. It combines two different kinds of clauses, one an independent clause and the other a subordinate clause, makes them into a whole to express a single thought. Notice that it doesn't matter what order the clauses are in. The subordinate clause could come first, or the independent clause could come first. In this particular sentence, the subordinate clause comes first, but it could have been the other way around. Either way, it's considered a complex sentence.